Oh, good morning. So behind me is cult leader Victor Bernard. And you can tell by the way he's dressed what he thinks of himself, or what he's trying to portray, some sort of benevolent leader of his flock. The reality is that Victor Bernard was a fraud. He was a con man, he was a monster. And in 1996, he moved his cult to a rural county in Minnesota. Pine County. Pine County is between Duluth and the Twin Cities. He brought his cult into a township, effectively doubling the size of the township. And from there, left a path of destruction, criminal activity, and destroyed many lives. One of the worst aspects is that he preyed on what he thought were the most vulnerable people in his cult, the children. Behind me is a picture of Jess embracing Victor Bernard. He began having sex with Jess when she was 12 years old. He was about 39 years old. He separated her from her parents. And he also did the same thing with Lindsay, who's in the picture behind me as well. Lindsay was 13 years old when Victor Bernard began having sex with her. And the abuse of these girls lasted 9 to 10 years into their adulthood. Now, he made a mistake. He thought they were the most vulnerable people in his cult. But the most vulnerable turned to be the most powerful. This is Victor Bernard today. This is his mugshot. He's spending the next couple of decades locked in prison in an undisclosed location. He was brought down because of these two women. Here's a picture of about a year and a half ago. On the left is myself with Lindsay. That's the day that Victor Bernard pled guilty to the sex crimes against her, the numerous ones that occurred over those 10 years. We're also pictured with media. The media was helpful in breaking the story. And on the right is the date of sentencing. Of course, in the foreground are Lindsay and Jess today. And that was the day that Victor Bernard was sent to prison. And for myself, I was the prosecuting attorney on this case. This is one of my proudest cases. So we'll begin with what I want to talk about is the origins of the cult, the basics of what happened, and then if there's time left, I'll talk about some of the legal challenges that we have when we prosecute cult members and try to hold them accountable for some of these crimes. But I'll start with Victor Bernard. Victor Bernard was born in 1961. He's from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he had a good upbringing. He attended a private high school or private K-12 education in Minneapolis, very prestigious place. Many politicians, many business leaders, nonprofit leaders came from this school. He was an athlete, he excelled academically, he was charismatic, and upon graduation obtained a full scholarship to Hobart College in upstate New York. So he went to Hobart College, and this is when his life started going into turmoil. He was in his dorm his freshman year, and his mom was having mental health issues and was really putting a lot of emphasis on him and calling him. And he was missing home, he was feeling guilty. And that was a moment when an individual walked by his dorm room and said, "You look like you need Jesus in your life." And we've talked a lot about this, about college recruitment. This was a recruiter from the Way International, a large cult out of Ohio. And from that moment on, Victor Bernard got sucked in, passionately sucked in. He dropped out of college and put all his energy into this cult. Traveling, he worshipped Dr. Victor Wherewell. Ironically, his name's also Victor, but he was the leader of this Ohio cult. And a big part of what they did was they sucked people in with this advanced class for or power for abundant living, which I won't get into, but that was kind of the hook that started the cult. And he excelled so much that he was chosen for their leadership corps. So this cult basically had, I think at its peak, maybe 100,000 members or so, but they had a special leadership corps class, training class, and he was part of that. Loved every aspect of it. He married Dr. Werewell's personal secretary, Stephanie. So he was fully ingrained in this cult. Now in the early 80s, Dr. Werewell stepped away from the cult for, I guess, for health reasons. And at that point, there was a leadership struggle, and the cult basically split up. And also around the mid-80s, Dr. Werewell died, and it was discovered that he had been having sexual relations with many of the women in his cult, and there were orgies, adulterous affairs, and that was a huge scandal too. So that further imploded this cult. They're not like they were back then. And so what Victor Bernard did was he left as well, and he returned to Minnesota, got together with a couple of other former Way family members, and they bought some property in another rural county south of where Pine County is, and on a place called River Road near Rush City. And it was about 4 families, 4 former Way International. And they kept with the teachings of Dr. Werewell, and they would do fellowships on Sundays. They would increase to the weekends, and the weekends became weeks. And then the rules became instituted, the homeschooling, the manner of dress. And you can see how this cult started to grow. Victor Bernard emerged as its leader. And it was about this time that he started traveling in the United States, coming in contact with former Way International members, and selling him on his group, saying, we're going to be like the Way, similar doctrine, but all that scandalous stuff, we're going to be better than that. The only way this is going to work is if you come out to Minnesota and join us. And so the group started to grow. Now, as we've heard about with cults, one of the ways that people are controlled is to isolate. And so they talked about they wanted a camp, and they wanted a camp in a very rural location to further isolate its members. So they bought some property up in Pine County, Minnesota on the lake, a former restaurant with outbuildings. They called it Shepherd's Camp. And then they called the cult the River Road Fellowship from that Rush City location. And about the height, they had about 150 members, so not a large group, but all these members relocated to this camp property. Now they purchased the camp for $575,000 in 1996. And while I was preparing this case, my intern discovered a lot of documents with the property in our recorder's office. One of the documents was a large pamphlet that detailed the River Road Fellowship. They were trying to convince the auditor not to tax them for being a C3 or 501c3 or an exempt organization. But one of these I ran across was the original founders of this cult. And of course we have Victor Bernard and his wife Stephanie on the top left. The bottom left, Mark and Jean Franczat, they were described as the youth ministers. The right page are the trustees, or they call themselves the elders later on. David Larson, who was instrumental in reporting what had happened in this cult later on. Bottom left is Randy and Pam Rourke. Randy handled a lot of the construction business. Pam was Victor's personal secretary and was the one that arranged some of these sexual liaisons with the young girls. And on the bottom right, and we talked about this before, cults need an enforcer. Craig Elmblad was the cult's enforcer, was the cult's muscle. There's the Shepherd's Camp. This is the cover of that binder, the River Road Fellowship. Victor Bernard's ordination certificate. with a little, I guess you call that a little medallion on the left, Railroad Fellowship, Servants of Jesus Christ. And of course, the three people that ordained him were the elders in the Railroad Fellowship, so somewhat self-ordained. Somehow that's proof that this is legitimate. And here are some pictures of the camp. You can see it's a very bucolic place. It's on the lake, have a large amount of lakefront, a lot of beautiful homes, a worship center, a dining hall. And the families all had these nice little homes. Now, Victor Bernard, when they moved out there, he and his wife had, they had 4 kids, 4 boys. And one day, he got in front of the congregation and took his wedding ring off his hand and placed the wedding ring in a bowl in front of the congregation. And he was essentially symbolizing that he's divorcing his wife, and he told the congregation it's because he's married to the entire church. So we see where he's starting to plant seeds. You know, I think he had a master plan at that point. And so he moves out of his wife's home, moves across the lawn essentially to a lodge, which is behind me. The lodge was at the gate of the camp, and he spent his days writing books that nobody's read, except my unlucky intern in my class, or in my office, who I told him to do some research, and he said there was absolutely nothing of wisdom in there. But he spent his days, doing this. And he lived there, and if he saw a stranger coming up the driveway, he'd run outside and stop them and turn them around. So in about 2000, Victor Bernard gives a sermon. And for this sermon, he calls out basically the firstborn females in this cult for special treatment. And this might be a good juncture. I have a video. They did a docudrama about this case, and probably the same thing we did with Phil. If you want to gather up here, I can show you about 10 minutes of this, and this explains how he called out the individuals in the cult.
He's going to be actors.
Yeah, actors, and then what you're going to see, Lindsay, the girl, one of the girls here, is going to do some narration. So, let's start it. Sure. The guy playing Victor Bernard's great. He's like super in his role.
Let the blood of the Lamb cover all our sins.
Hold the mic up and record better.
Yeah, the mic, where's the microphone?
He's got it.
Oh my God, they did that? I didn't know that.
He uses the phrase blood of the Lamb covers all sins, and that's a common theme in the cult. So I excused his behavior with the girl.
Everyone was very silent. The lamb being killed was to signify
That's
Jesus
Lindsay
Christ dying
today.
for our sins and making us whole, and the blood of the lamb covers all.
Being that we looked at him as the man of God, what he said was what God desired for us to do. And so we followed. For love we followed. Love of God, love of Jesus Christ, love of Victor. Because we loved him and trusted him so much, we were considered sheep, and sadly we followed him to a slaughter.
In the summer of 2000, Victor gave a teaching to the church in the chapel at the shepherd's camp, and the whole church was there.
Whose damsel is this?
chosen for a spiritual sacrifice. Those chosen shall abide with me here at Shepherd's Camp, where they shall serve me in Christ with true commitment. Jess Schweiss. Lindsay Tornambi.
When I heard my name, I was kind of excited. I thought it would be like a good experience. I remember my mom just being excited that I was gonna go serve God and live at the camp. I remember my dad being sad. And I remember telling him, like, don't cry, like, I'll be back. Like, it's just, for a little while. So obviously I didn't understand what was really going on. Or I had no idea what was about to happen.
The sexual drone footage at the camp.
The maidens were the firstborn females of the family that were set apart in the flower of their youth to serve the Lord. They were taken from their homes and they lived together. They basically served Victor. It was a privilege, basically, to be considered a maiden.
The maidens were a group of 10 girls who took care of Victor in pretty much everything he had. Come on, gather around. Take a seat. No, come on, ladies. Come on.
And this lady represents that Pam Coke, or Pam Rourke I talked about earlier. The personal
You are
secretary.
among the chosen few who are to live with our Savior. A maiden's service is one of our highest callings, but with duty comes great expectation. You must wear your hair up unless you are with Victor or each other. No makeup, no polish, as you know. You must protect your modesty at all times.
Yeah.
You are to avert your eyes to anyone but our Savior. Every day, one of you will wake Victor. Two of you will prepare the bathroom and attend to his needs. Another of you will make his breakfast. The rest will be on call to clean or do whatever you may need. Always remember, this is a privilege, not a reward. And the cardinal rule, you must never be alone with another man.
The first night at the Shepherd's Camp, I cried myself to sleep. I missed my family. The end of July of 2000, I was 13 years old, and I remember being called up to the lodge. Victor wanted to see me.
Lindsay, you're working very hard. God sees it. So do I.
So grateful he chose me.
Look at me, Lindsay.
You just have to watch.
Do you touch yourself?
I'm not sure I do.
Don't play games with me.
No, I'm not. I don't know what that means.
Get out!
I felt bad that I made Victor mad because that was the last thing I wanted to do. I wanted to, please him. maiden came in and said Victor called and asked me to go to the lodge. I didn't want to make him mad again.
Lindsay, God loves you. You know that, right?
Yes.
I want to show you how much He loves you. And one way for me to do that is for you to submit to me. To do what's natural, spiritual.
It was, yeah.
What's the name of the film?
It's called In an Instant. It was part of 2020. It was on ABC last summer.
Oh, wow. Is it on YouTube now or something?
It might be on their website, In an Instant.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's even hard to watch or read.
Yeah.
Because it's so real when you know those stories. You know?
So that was a clip from In an Instant that appeared in ABC last June, or excuse me, June of 2017. It was a docudrama done by Committee Films. So I'll give them a lot of credit. They put a lot of research into it. And actually out of Minnesota, nearby Minneapolis. It might be available on their website. But it's about an hour and a half, and it features a lot about the story and the investigation. So as you saw, he called out 10 girls from the cult and essentially separated them from their families. And he moved these girls into a fourplex on the camp property. This fourplex was separated from the main area, from the dining hall and the residences. It's actually up a long driveway. These are pictures that I took when I took a tour of the property. And actually in one of them you can kind of see Jess and Lindsay and a victim advocate walking together. But there were 3 girls in each of the top units and 2 girls in each of the bottom units. And Victor Bernard had a section cleared next to the fourplex and some utilities put in, and he moved his RV in next door to this fourplex. And so as it was explained in that clip, the girls had a schedule of taking care of him. I mean, they would stand outside the shower with towels for him, so when he walked out, they'd grab a towel and put food out for him, wake him up. It was incredible. So he's living this kind of secreted life inside a secreted location. Now here's an actual picture from the day that they moved into the fourplex. I know Benny talked about the kids when they have their pictures taken smiling, and you're going to see a lot of that. I'll show you a few more pictures. This is one of those pictures where I see kind of a bit of a glimmer of fear in some of the eyes of the girls here. There's Victor Bernard with Lindsay and Jess in kind of the foreground. And you can tell by the manner of dress how they made their own clothes. They made clothes for Victor. A lot of time singing, a lot of time spent together. In this cult, all the male members were basically out working, have businesses, construction companies, working from dawn to dusk. The women worked on the property, and Victor Bernard was there mainly for his own recreation. And a lot of them lived in poverty. They had basically lived in double wide trailer homes. The girls talk about reusing coffee grounds. And at the same time, Victor Bernard's driving an Escalade. He's got a chrome-plated RV, has a Harley Davidson, a supposed man of God. There they are, having fun smashing grapes. I thought it was interesting that one of the pictures was a close-up of Victor Bernard's foot smashing graves, because that's their savior. Never mind the fact he had terrible athlete's feet, but the savior's not immune from that. More singing and dancing, music, and all these pictures, they look happy, but there's a lot going on underneath.
They don't look happy. They don't look happy. They look bored.
Right.
Yes.
What happened?
They'd like to go up to, there's a state park that they went up to in the North Shore of Minnesota, and they would sit around and play music. I always thought that would be annoying if you were hiking up there. Now, a few years into this arrangement, Victor Bernard went to each of the parents of the girls, and he brought Craig Elmblad with him, the muscle of the group. And he sat down with the parents, told the parents that eventually he was probably going to have sexual relations with their daughter. Now, the way he phrased it, it sounded like this would be something in the future. This had actually been happening for years at this point. And he wanted the parents' consent. So again, he's got the muscle with him, he's the leader, and of course all the parents consent to it, which is always kind of a difficulty in these cases when you've got to litigate them. So they know what's happening, but he says it hasn't happened yet. But he claims because he is Jesus in the flesh, if he has sex with your daughters, they still remain virgins. So, not a big deal, right? But he wants to solidify their commitment to him. And so they do kind of a marriage ceremony with these 10 girls called the Salt Covenant. So each of the girls, they have a ceremony, they put on a ring, and they each drop some salt on their tongue. And this is a picture taken from the day that Jess had her Salt Covenant. And if you look at the parents, especially the mother, looks like she's very proud of her daughter for being in this arrangement. There's Victor with the maidens. I'll point out one of them here, right next to Lindsay. Her name's Christina. Christina is from Brazil, and she was a exchange student at a college north of Pine County, and she got sucked into this cult at that point. She plays an important role later on because her family's very wealthy and had multiple residences in Brazil. That's where he ended up hiding out for some time. Now, an important piece of evidence in this case, actually a couple, was Lindsay and Jess kept calendars. And this is a calendar from May of 2001. I think it's Lindsay's. And when she had sexual relations with Victor Bernard, she put an X on that day, on the number. So here we have 2. So it's great evidence when you're going back 10 years to prosecute a case, or 15 years. So you know what dates that some of this happened. But some of the other entries are really interesting. On the 20th, it says Dr. Victor Werewolf falls asleep. So he really plays an important part in the cult. Victor Bernard comes home, exclamation mark. They talk about dates that Victor Bernard was there. Jess had a similar calendar, and the way she coded it was fellowship with Victor was code for it. That was the day that she had sex with him. So now in 2004, 2010, I call this the implosion period. So in 2004, they sell the camp. They sell it for $3.5 million. So they bought it for $575,000 only 8 years prior. They made a lot of money. And they took this camp, or they took the money, and kind of like what I've been hearing with the move is his grand vision was to have multiple compounds. And so they purchased 3 large properties in Pine County. And each of the properties had businesses, homes next to each other. Most of them were double wides. They had dairy, they had a cabinet shop, they had a construction company, they built spec homes. This is one of the locations, some of the outbuildings, they had their own kind of architecture scheme too. This was another location in Pine County. Victor Bernard, of course, got the nice places. He had a place at each of these locations. The middle was a nice little cedar cabin they built for him. And the cedar cabin overlooked a beautiful area behind it, a large field. Up the hill behind the cabin was a renovated farmhouse. That's where the maidens lived. And there was, of course, a path between the farmhouse and the cabin. So that was one of the scenes of our crime, that a lot of the sex occurred there. On either side is one of the worship centers that Victor Bernard met with his congregation. Kind of an interesting side story on that is a grandparent of one of the cult members was concerned about the kids, so the grandparents showed up to kind of check in what's going on here, and they invited her to a congregation. And she described the surreal experience of being in this church. It was packed, and Victor Bernard's sitting at the front in a recliner and chain smoking. And people are performing for him, the kids are doing skits and stuff, and it's all there for his benefit and his recreation. They built a $500,000 home for Victor Bernard at one of the sites. It had about 5 bedrooms, numerous porches. There was no driveway to it, but there was a pathway to another home. The path was to a home where he decided he wanted a second group of maidens. So here's another picture with him and a lot of females. These are basically 2 groups of maidens. And they gave all the properties weird biblical names. No idea what that means. This is a picture of the neighboring house. They purchased a home, they converted it to a duplex. There was a side entrance, and that's a side entrance that he had a path to for the second group of maidens. And then at this point, the youth ministers that you saw earlier, they became the caretakers of this group. So I was going to show another clip, but in the interest of time, I'll just describe what happened. Around 2009, that period of time, David Larson, one of the trustees or the elders of this cult, found out that Victor Bernard was having an affairs with married women. And he wrote this long letter, I have a copy of it, describing their history together and saying, this is exactly what the way was about, and now you're turning this into the way. You need to get in front of the congregation and confess your sins, or I'm going to law enforcement. And so eventually Victor Bernard did give a sermon to the congregation, and he admitted that he had multiple affairs with married women in the cult. He didn't talk about the maidens or the young girls, but about the married women. And this is when things started imploding on this group. Now, in one instance, the person didn't report to law enforcement, but a mandated reporter outside the group learned of this. That mandated reporter went to law enforcement, reported it, the adulterous affairs, and there was an investigation. So in 2010, they do an investigation of the affairs, and then it's submitted to their then county attorney, that office. I wasn't county attorney at the time. And this declined memo, it actually made it out in the media, but an attorney reviewed it and declined to charge any charges on it. And the decline says, it appears the sexual relationships were entered into voluntarily. It's the highlighted section. So this is kind of highlights what law enforcement or prosecution doesn't know about these type of groups. Was this really voluntary? And the clip I would have showed, if you were interested, I can show it later, but it shows how he seduced some of these women in this group, especially with these mind control methods and stuff. But it was simply dismissive. There was a mention of, well, this is just brainwashing. They admit they're brainwashed, so it's their fault. So we're not doing anything about this. And interesting enough, at the end, the attorney declined it says, The state also examined whether or not, due to Bernard's position as an unlicensed pastor, that he would qualify as a psychotherapist, but Bernard does not meet the requirements of the definition. That's actually legally incorrect. So that was tossed aside, and then the group splintered. They left a bunch of bankruptcies, foreclosures, and a lot of them went out to Washington, some went to Wisconsin, some went to Pennsylvania, and some went to Brazil. And so he's out of Pine County at this point. I always wonder if they would have charged him at that point, we probably would have prevented about 6 years of litigation and trying to find him. So he's gone. Lindsay has left the group, Jess has left the group. They've been out about 2 or 3 years. And in January of 2012, Lindsay's at a New Year's Eve party. And she's spent pretty much, well, her entire life at that point almost in this cult, except for about a year or two. And she's at a party with women her age, in their early 20s. And she says this is the moment that it hits her. They're talking about their lives, their childhoods, their experiences. They're talking about college, relationships. And she realizes that she had none of that. And that it was all stolen from her. And she said that was when it really hit her. And that was January 1st, 2012. And she started reaching out, and the person that she talked to was Jess Schweiss, the other girl I mentioned earlier. And of course, they were physically assaulted. They were never supposed to talk about this, abused. But she opened up to her talked about the sexual relations with Victor Bernard, the abuse. And Jess said that it happened to her too. And they agreed to go to law enforcement and report it. And given it had been so much time, they probably thought nothing would come of it, but they went in. So Lindsay reported on January 3rd, 2012. Jess came in the next day on the 4th and reported hers. And that's when an investigation was launched by the county sheriff's office. And they did a wonderful job. I mean, they went down every angle. Any name that they found that was tied to this cult, they interviewed them. And we've got some of the pictures of the files in my office, the stacks of information. Jess kept a lot of material. She had boxes of pictures, calendars, notebooks, very helpful in all this. So these big boxes are compiled, and then they're sent up to the county attorney's office at that time. And for 2 years, nothing happened. Lindsay and Jess call the county attorney's office. Why aren't there charges? How come nothing's happening here? They go to the FBI, nothing happens. They write to the senators, the representatives, nothing happens. And the sheriff at the time was frustrated too that there were no charges coming out of the office. And so he asked some of his colleagues, well, what do we do at this point? The other sheriffs say, tell the survivors to go to the media and give them their story. And so in March of 2014, over 2 years after this was reported, Lindsay talks with a reporter, Tom Lydon, at Fox 9 News in Minneapolis. And of course he knows a good story when he hears it. And then that's when they do kind of a large expose on the nightly news about what's going on. And there were multiple reports from that. This was a still frame photo from one of those Fox 9 reports. They interview Lindsay and Jess. When this comes to light, and when it comes to light that the county attorney hasn't charged it, that's when the county attorney at the time actually reassigned the case to one of his prosecutors and said, you go forward and you charge it. Find out what's this case. The person he assigned it to is a person named Michelle. She's now my chief deputy in my office, great lawyer. When she was reassigned the case, she spent a full month going through it. Eventually what came out of that was a complaint charging Victor Bernard with 59 counts of criminal sexual conduct felonies. And some of those counts under Minnesota law if you're proclaimed to be a minister and you're doing this as part of your ministry, that's a felony count as well, even if it happens as when that person's an adult. So think about that with the prior decline memo, where they said that wasn't the law. You know, Michelle knows what the law was, so she charged it under that as well. But it's 2014, they've been gone 4 years, and nobody except the cult knows where Victor Bernard is at this time. And so then an international manhunt is launched. It's on worldwide media. This is kind of a copy of his Interpol release. It says mugshot is thrown out worldwide. It's been featured on the always understated Nancy Grace. The big story. There was a feature, a whole episode of The Hunt dedicated to the case. John Walsh. Have a good episode. And locally, it factored a lot into the media. At the exact time the charges came out, I was actually running for county attorney. So Victor Bernard actually helped me in my election. A reporter called me one day and said, hey, you know, this case factored into your campaign, and you know, the reporter asked me that. Of course it does. And so she wrote a story, and I didn't think it was probably in the back page somewhere. It came out on the very front page of a major Minneapolis paper, or major Minnesota paper. So the U.S. Marshal Service got involved with hunting him down, and so this is April 2014, and they spend months interviewing people, tracking the cult's finances. They eventually figured out that he's probably in Brazil or Canada, but they found that the cult members, some of the maidens were going to Brazil. They kept flying to Brazil, and they kept doing it by a very circuitous route. They jumped from different airports, used different credit cards. Eventually, they kind of going through security in Brazil, and they had surveillance in Brazil watching. And it was from that they figured out that he was down there. Most likely, he was with that Christina, that wealthy Brazilian maiden that was in his group. And he was eventually tracked to a condominium in a seaside town. So living the good life, he's all tan and hanging out at a nice place. And they go in, they arrest him. Somebody took a picture of him on his couch for some reason. And that's the picture that went worldwide when he was arrested. And on the top right is the text message I received when he was arrested. Bernard is in custody in Brazil. Not public yet. Of course, I write, great job, Marshals. I misspelled Marshals, so I'm not happy about that still. And then he said, and because it was in public, they got to confirm my identity and such, but they confirmed that it was him. And at that moment, I was eating pancakes with my kids. Jen was making them, I have to note that. And this was February of 2015, and I had been county attorney 2 months. And I had one of the biggest cases in Minnesota just landed in my lap. And then, he doesn't come back right away. Now we got to extradite him from Brazil. And he fights extradition for over a year. He gets beat up in a Brazilian prison. And after he's beat up, he decides maybe he doesn't want to be there anymore. And so that changed things for him. This is just a picture of the affidavit I had to send to Brazil. It's in Portuguese. I thought that was kind of interesting. So that took well over a year. It was June of 2016 that he was finally in the air and back to Pine County. And that's the text message I received from the sheriff. And he writes, run strong, Victor's in the air. He wrote that because that day I was running a marathon. So, kind of his sense of humor. So he landed at 10:30. And there's his mugshot after being in Brazil for almost a year and a half. A lot of Gilbert Gottfried jokes on the internet about it, but that's how he looked like. Kind of beat up. And so we have this, the cult members start liquidating some of their assets, and they hire some very high-powered defense attorneys from Minneapolis. And now begins the litigation phase of the case, which goes on for about 4 months, which is rather short. And they go back and forth. They know what they're facing because of this extensive investigation, these boxes of materials. I'm very confident. Victor Bernard is really resistant at first, and he keeps telling his attorneys that these 2 girls will never testify against me. He still thinks he's that powerful. And I met with the 2 girls, and I knew within 10 seconds of seeing them that they were believable, they were strong, they were confident, they were telling the truth. I had nothing to worry about with this case, and I portrayed that to the defense attorneys. And then the conversation changed from, we're going to litigate this, to, can you plead them out?
Yeah.
And then they started throwing numbers at me, and I said, I'm not taking anything less than 30 years, 30 years. And then one day, I mentioned to him too, I even hired a cult expert who's somewhere in this room. But I said, I got a great report. We're going to come after him with everything we got. I don't care if this takes me 6 weeks to try this case, I'm going to do it. One day his lawyer comes in on a Friday, minutes before we close. The lawyer's wearing a t-shirt and jeans. He looks kind of haggard, but he says, Victor Bernard wants to plead guilty. And he wants the maximum sentence. So the dynamic changed. I think it was because he didn't want what was going on there for years to be further exposed in the media because of all the media attention that this case has received. Was one of his reasons for doing that. I think too that he wanted to fall on his sword and act like he's being a prophet for his flock. So maybe that would look redeeming to him. And so he pled guilty, and then he was sentenced. Front page Star Tribune cult leader sentenced to 30 years. And then there's Lindsay and Jess smiling on a Facebook post, where Lindsay says, or Jess says, today Lindsay and I were able to share a portion of our story in court, and as the New York Magazine said, ended a cult. I am proud of myself, proud of us. This has been a long time coming, and justice was served. I am grateful for all the wonderful love and support I've received from everyone. So the 2 girls that he probably thought were the most vulnerable people in this cult brought this guy down, brought this cult down, and exposed this con man for who he was. I don't know if I have time for further.
Yes.
Okay. So after all this, kind of reflecting back on it, some lessons learned as a lawyer from prosecution. When preparing for the case, I talked to a lot of people in the community. It's kind of one of those parts of being somewhat of a politician, but you chat with people, they always ask about this case. They asked about what was going on, and they all said the same thing. How could these people give up their daughter to this guy? And to me, that was a hurdle because, those of us who are parents know that. How could we never give our kids up. They must be weak-willed. They must be idiots to be in this cult. And you think about the past and what has been portrayed, with drinking the Kool-Aid, mass suicide, following the guy from Heaven's Gate. You always think that these are just weak-willed, simple people. And they're not. It's not until recently we're recognizing this as mass murder, not mass suicide. And they're also victims as well. So how do you get past that hurdle and talk to a jury of laypersons about this who may have these preconceptions? One of my personal heroes was a guy named Vince Bugliosi. He was the prosecutor of the Manson case. I actually met him once, about 20-some years ago. It's just weird that I thought he was just a great prosecutor, and then 20 years later I'm prosecuting a cult case. Never really thought to make that connection, but he was interesting because he had to show that Charles Manson was in such control of individuals that they murdered people on his behalf, even though he was never at the murder scenes themselves. So that's a fascinating study in how to convince a jury of doing that. So I thought about him, and then I thought about what are the typical jurors. The jurors that we typically have is my side. We get rid of all the crazy people in the jury. That's how we eliminate people in Minnesota. And then, of course, the defense, they get rid of all the sane people that I like. And what we're kind of left with is a small cross-section of the population. Most of them are, don't have college degrees, have some college, mainly high school graduates, have mid-level jobs. And so what's their common understanding of things, and how can we take some perceptions and change them to a better understanding of a theory of our case that these people were, basically controlled to do this. One way to do that is that through expert testimony. Well, that's a nice picture. So some questions that, so we hired Dr. Lalich, and she combed through all our materials and provided us with a wonderful report.
Mounds of material.
Right. And some of the questions that I had is the River Road Fellowship a cult? What are cult leader characteristics? How could someone fall for this? Is it common for the reporting to be delayed? If you remember, they got out of the cult in 2009, 2010, but didn't report until 2012. Very common characteristic. How could parents give up their children? And how could the abuse continue into adulthood? Because, they were abused as girls, but it lasted into their early 20s. How could this continue in a cult? And Dr. Lalich had great answers for these. So that was one of those hurdles that I think expert testimony helps overcome. Another hurdle, of course, are the remaining cult members. This is a letter from Lindsay Tornambi's mother. And Lindsay wrote this to the Brazilian authorities on behalf of Victor Bernard. So Lindsay's mother, I won't read it all, but she says, "My name is Peggy Livingstone, the mother of Lindsay Tornambi, one of the women who is making accusations and pressing criminal charges against Victor Bernard. I have much sorrow for Lindsay and for the direction she's gone in turning away from God, the Bible, and her minister. I also have concern that Victor is suffering consequences because of false accusations." And from what I've heard, the mother is still deeply subservient to Victor. There's another letter. This one is from Lindsay's sister. And I'm writing this letter to share with you the truth about what Lindsay Tornambi's life was really like at Shepherd's Camp and how happy she was when she lived there. We grew up together, and I witnessed the love and thankfulness she had for our minister, Victor Bernard. What she is now saying Victor did to her during those years makes me very upset because none of it is true. So, I always admire Lindsay's strength and Jess's strength too, because these family dynamics and of course other survivors as well. Of course, these are photos of some jailhouse interviews, or I guess inmate calls. These are all former maidens, continue to visit him in the jail. We have hundreds and hundreds of hours of recordings from this. And the jail visiting is every other day. It starts at a specific time, ends at a time. They were there when it started. They were all the way there when it ended. There were elders that visited him. These girls are very devoted to him. And if you really want to cure insomnia, you can listen to the conversations. They're just hours and hours of them reading the Bible or in books that interpret the Bible. And a lot of Victor Bernard just nodding.
Was this in Minnesota?
Yeah, this is in our jail, a couple floors down from me. Yeah. It was interesting too because there were glimpses of Victor Bernard's narcissism in these. I remember one point, kind of humorous, was he kept asking about how his mugshot looked in media. And you saw it earlier, it's horrible, but these girls, big smiles. "Oh, you're so handsome, Victor, and you look great." And
Oh, jeez.
yeah, just incredible. One of the elders came in and asked him how much money he wanted in his canteen fund. And he says, "That's not how I live. Just put money in it. I don't want to know the amount, because I don't have to be concerned about that." This is a guy who's never had any property, his name, possessions, nothing. Everything was in the cult's name, and they took care of him. He still wanted to be kept taken care of in the jail. And another consideration are statute of limitations. There's different statute of limitations in states. Fortunately, in Minnesota, statute of limitations for child sexual abuse is kind of a modified deal where it's the later of 9 years after it happened or 3 years after it's reported to law enforcement. So they reported in 2012, that ran 3 years, so that we had to have charges by 2015. So that's how we're able to go back, a decade and a half and prosecute him for these crimes. Normal statute of limitations in our state for any other crime is about 3 years. So there is hope. If there is, some states are limited and some states have unlimited with sexual abuse. And I think Phil touched on this some too, is how far down a rabbit hole do you go with cults and litigating cases? And that's the balance I was trying to strike here too, was in preparing for trial, how much of this is relevant to the control issue and what happened? And is it going to go too far where you're going to lose the center of the story? And so I keep in mind that the attention in this case belongs to Lindsay and Jess. They are the story. This is the crime. Of course, they're on the left with all the media attention here. So I thought about that balance as I prepared for trial. That was on the date of sentencing. Lindsay's hand's on the left, Jess's was on the right. I took that picture. It's one of my favorite pictures and made the front page of our local newspaper when the reporter saw that I did that. But no, thank you. If you have any questions.
I have a question. Do you have a sense of what his life would have, just as you thought about him, and I'm sure you thought about him a lot, whether it was, and he got into this situation where he had absolute power and one about absolute, one of the reasons he did these things was because he could, right?
Right.
Do you have a sense of whether there's an inevitability to his life going the way it went in terms of this becoming a cult leader? In other words, had he not been recruited, that when he got to that campus at Hobart, had he not been recruited, that what are the alternative paths his life could have taken?
Yeah, I've actually thought about that a lot, and I don't know if I ever had a good answer, but that's an interesting question that I've had as well. From what I know about him, and from the reports I read with his family members and stuff, is that he always considered himself sort of a ladies' man, and so it just seems like the cliche is perfect storm, but it seems like a perfect storm where he has that motivation kind of out of everything, and it just happens to match what being a leader provides him, or what the control that it provided him to exploit this aspect of his personality. That's a good question.
Were there ever any concerns from his own natural family or previous relationships where this is going in a bad direction? I mean, were there any kind of signals that came from anyone?
And there were reports too that they talked to his father and he had concerns about him, but they talked to childhood friends. I mean, tough friend or friends that had been with him for years, and they talked about the marked change where they had this bind together, and he joined this cult, and then it said that if you weren't part of that, you were out of his life, and so there were concerns about that, but I don't know if it was ever reported or acted on, which to me is kind of another theme when I look at all this, because everybody in Pine County that been there for years has a cult story, an interaction with this group. And they knew that this was a cult, there's something weird going on, everything's fenced off, this one guy keeps stopping cars and turning people back. I know the guy who delivered propane there talked about how he'd be on site and he'd actually see Victor Bernard go into a house with a female, and sometime later he'd come out. And he'd come out and he'd be chain smoking and come up to him, start talking to him, what he was doing there, and leave. But everybody knew something was going on, but they acted kind of under the radar in a way because it was such a rural, isolated place.
Interesting.
I'm just kind of curious what happened to his wife. Is she still in the cult, or did she?
So his wife lives in Washington, and when Victor Bernard was back in here and in jail, she filed divorce papers against him. But she refused to cooperate with investigation. So we reached out to her, or the sheriff's office reached out to her while this was going on. He was on the lam. And then even after the divorce, I told the investigator, call her up, maybe she's had a change of heart, and still completely would not talk about it, or him. It was interesting, one of his sons called me one day out of the blue and said that whatever you need from me, you tell me.
Really?
Yeah. He said he hated the bastard, I think is the phrase he used.
Wow.
And just one other side note on that, I forgot to mention is afterwards Lindsay sued the cult civilly, so she sued, Stephanie Bernard was one of the people that's mentioned, all the elders I talked about earlier were sued, the fellowship as an entity and their insurance company were sued.
Wow.
And that case was settled out of court for, well, it's confidential, but.
Whatever happened to Pam Lord?
They also live in the state of Washington, so.
And is she still a believer?
She is, yeah. I've got video of her visiting Bernard in jail and just fawning over him.
Wow.
Wow.
And I think, yeah, I think there's a lot between their relationship as well. And her husband was there with her too, and he was really fawning over Victor as well, and she kept asking him to share Bible verses with him. But and the sad part is, these elders moved on with their lives and were able to be fairly successful. They're living in, a $600,000 house out in Washington State. And the youth ministers out there, they moved on. But one of the things that Lindsay did that was kind of cool was when she sued him civilly, her and her lawyer traveled out to Washington to the town that they lived in and stood out and handed out leaflets to people. The local news caught them, and she posted their pictures up. The newspapers got all their names, and they started going to the houses of these supposed elders, knocking on the door, identifying them, getting them on camera. Even if they're slamming the doors in their faces, they're being exposed.
Wow.
Mm.
So, I should probably know the answer to this, but in a criminal case, there's no way to file charges against the people who aided and abetted. Like if there's a robbery and someone drives the car, they usually get charged too, but because these are sexual abuse cases, that doesn't apply.
You could be charged as aiding and abetting, and that's, I think if I would have had this case years earlier, there's at least one person I probably would have charged in addition with aiding and abetting, but the statute of limitations actually expired on that by the time I saw it in my office. So I came in January 2015, and and that's, of course, January is when it expired. And I was sworn in January 5th. The last report was made January 4th of 2012, so one day after the 3 years. So I couldn't do anything about it in my capacity.
But it could be possible.
Yes, I would say yes, it was possible. I think especially with Victor Bernard's secretary, there's strong evidence there because she actually she gave the girls like sex manuals.
Oh,
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
How many defendants were there in the civil case altogether, do you know?
Oh boy, there were probably a dozen because basically all the people from before, the Elwes, the Larsons, so that's what, 2, 4, 6, probably about a dozen.
Yeah, I
And
think it was about a dozen.
yeah, and Stephanie, they sued Victor Bernard's sister, who still lives in my county, strangely enough. And then the entities as well. So, of course, the deep pockets are the insurance companies, but I think the members had some assets as well. They made $3 million off of that sale. The FBI tried to track the money and we couldn't figure out where it went. But.
Interesting.
Went to Brazil, maybe.
I'm thinking it went to Brazil, yeah.
Can you
Do
talk
the
a little
girls
bit?
have any contact with their families anymore?
It varies, so Lindsay doesn't have any contact with her mother, from my understanding. And her father, a guy named Carmen Tornambi, was always in this really weird place where he wanted to be helpful, but he wasn't helpful. And she doesn't really talk to him either. But it's interesting, you can find this on YouTube. She went on Dr. Phil and confronted her father
Oh, wow.
on TV,
Wow.
yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's interesting watching him squirm, because he knew something, but didn't want to take that step in admitting it, what he did to his daughter.
Can you kind of go over a little bit about Brazil and how hard it was to extradite him? Because that was a long process. I was horrified that country.
Yeah, that was a very odd process. So that was February 2015 and lasted till June of 2016. And the Department of Justice got involved with that. I had to work with them. The Brazilian prosecutors got involved. Strangely enough, the Brazilian prosecutors were actually easier to work with than the Department of Justice. But they're actually good about keeping me updated and getting information. But yeah, it was touch and go. It was very nerve-wracking. I'd get emails from the Department of Justice. I'd make a comment to the media or something because I was frustrated. You heard nothing for months. And then I get a nasty gram saying, don't talk to the media, now Brazil's going to be mad at you, and they're going to let Victor Bernard go because of that. And it was stuff like that. There was a day where Brazil said, well, you're not here, we're going to let him go. And they were doing this power play, and it was actually against the 1964 extradition treaty. So what they were doing was illegal, but how do you go after a country for illegally detaining somebody? And they wanted conditions also on his release. They wanted the guarantees on maximum sentences, something I can't give a guarantee on. I can say, well, this is what I'm looking at, but a judge can sentence him, but they can't make guarantees to a foreign country. And so that went back and forth, and then it was a surprise on the day we got him, because it was the last minute. They basically took him and another guy from a sex offender from Iowa and stuck him on a tarmac and said, here you go, United States, come get him, or they're gone.
Mm-hmm.
And our fear was that if we didn't get him, he'd go across the border to Argentina. And so there was some evidence that he was trying to go over there, because there is no real extradition, my understanding, with with the United States. So it looked like he wanted to kind of set up the whole cult system down in a foreign country where it'd probably be even safer from law enforcement there.
To your knowledge, has there ever been a case where parents were charged with like child endangerment for putting their children at risk for sexual abuse in a cult?
I think there has been some cases. I think, Yana, you were working on one like that, weren't you?
Well, the one I'm working on is the mother is being prosecuted for the death of her two daughters, as well as the cult leader. Yeah. I don't know, Phil, do you know any of those?
No, but I'm sure there are.
Yeah.
I'm sure there, and it comes up in the religious context around failing to get medical treatment. I don't know about in the sexual situation,
Yeah.
but where parents have made their child available to a predator. I don't know of any case like that. There certainly are cases in which parents have been charged
Faith healing.
with failing faith healing
Yeah.
stuff, where they failed to get medical treatment for this child. But I don't know a case where, to answer the narrow question,
Yeah,
where a parent has been charged for allowing
sexual abuse.
their child to be subjected to sexual abuse. I feel like, not in the cult context, I feel like there have been stories that I don't know personally, but of parents selling their kids, so that those trafficking.
Yeah.
So there are certainly
There are
trafficking cases,
Yeah.
but not in the situation analogous to what Reese is talking about, that I'm aware of. There may be, but they would be, should be, but I'm not aware of that.
so much.